Hello. Uh, this is part of a talk that I did for USF Senior Citizens Learning in Tampa, Florida, a couple of years ago. And they named the title, maybe somewhat misleading, because you're not actually going to need a passport for traveling, but we'll take a journey, a virtual journey, so to speak, through Indian civilization of last 4,000 years over the next few hours in various stages. Now, when we talk about US history, we're talking in terms of centuries, but for older civilizations such as India, Egypt, Greece, and China, we're talking in terms of millennium or thousands of years. Now, again, the, moving on to what India is as to whether it's a country, is it a nation, is it a federation of various states, or is it a subcontinent? Now, the first encounters that European cultures had with India was somewhere in 1498 when Vasco da Gama made a trip around the Cape of Good Hope and ended up on the west coast of India, somewhere south of Bombay or Mumbai as it is called now, and established Portuguese colonies. And he wasn't exactly the most friendly person, but more on that later. Now, if depending upon how old you are, this may be your impression of India, is India was considered to be a basket case, a starving nation with famines, cholera, and dirt. And at the same time, you may have heard something about Mahatma Gandhi and Taj Mahal, and that's about the size of your uh, recollection of India. And perhaps some isolated yogis, or if you were adventurous enough to travel and looking for uh, cheap travel and ended up with trying to find yourself in Nepal. That may be your recollection from the 60s. And of course, who does not remember the Hare Krishnas who made a rather uh, visible presence at US airports now? Back in the 90s, when the call centers were coming into vogue, and at that time, people were rightfully frustrated with the Indian accent, even though we were both speaking the same language. More recently, the star of India has risen, and perhaps with the advent of technological success and with prominent people like Satya Nadella and others who are leading major technological companies. Now, again, let's start with a name. How does the name India came about? It's uh, uh, it's based on the one of the major rivers in northwest part of India. There is a very fertile region called Punjab, which comprises of 5 rivers, and one of the rivers, the main one, but is in presently Pakistan, is called Sindhu. And the Greeks, when they first came to India, now you may be surprised. What were the Greeks doing in India? Yes, the word conqueror Alexander the Great did travel up to the border of India. And at that time, there was the first contact with the European civilization with the Indian subcontinent. Now, Greeks had difficulty pronouncing the word Sindhu, that led to the word Indus, and subsequently India came about. In the Muslim the word was Hindustan, and there's a big mountain range in the Karakoram which is called Hindu Kush, means dates to the Hindus, while the Indian classical name in the Vedic civilization is Bharat, which is recognized as an alternate name in the Indian constitution. Which now to study history of and people's history of any region, it is best to start with geography. India can be divided into 4 separate regions: the hill country of the north, the great northern fertile plains, the Deccan Plateau, with some mountains range extending on both east and west sides from the middle all the way to the tip, the western ones being higher. So most of the rivers flow from west to east, and the fertile coastal plains, which are where agriculture is very productive. Now, the Indian geography, history, peopling have all been influenced by monsoon, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But before that, how did the subcontinent of India arise when the whole landmass was united with a called Gondwana, part of the Antarctica, broke loose and traveled slowly over millions of years across what was known as Tethys Ocean and rammed into the Eurasian plate, and giving rise to the big mountain range, which is presently the Himalayas, and which divides the two big uh, overpopulated and large nations of Asia, i.e., India and China. Now, again, as you can see from this diagram, there are more people living in this circle, which includes not only India and China, but other large populous countries such as Bangladesh and Indonesia and various Southeast Asian nations. Now, the original civilization that you may be very familiar with include Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, and China. But the number three may come as a bit of a surprise to you because it was discovered by archaeologists purely by accident, and now it is aptly called Indus Valley Civilization. And the primary names that will come across are Mohenjo-daro, it's the mountain of the dead, and Harappa, which is a small village on the banks of the one of the Indus River. Now, uh, as I mentioned earlier, the Indian geography and history is heavily influenced by the monsoon patterns, but you can see that it starts rather predictably sometime in June, ending in late October, and the winter months being dry, except on the east coast where the wet clouds strike the Himalayas and return back, giving rise to two rainy seasons on the east coast of India. Now, the reason for the large population of India is that the amount of land that is available for agriculture is substantially large. And even though the area of India itself is small, they're able to have arable land as much as that of United States. Now, and as we said, so that again was the ideal situation for settlement of people of Indian subcontinent for thousands of years. Now, it is interesting and delightful to compare subcontinent of Europe and India, and they are both fairly large land masses, Europe extending primarily east to west, India extending north to south. They both have a large number of states, a large number of languages, ethnic diversity. They both had to face Islamic invasion. The Europeans were far more successful in stopping the Islam at their gate, primarily in Cordoba, and also near the Byzantine Empire. And while the Indians were far less successful, and India was under Muslim rule from around 1000 current era to 1858, when the Brits sent the last Mughal emperor in exile after the Indian Mutiny or the War of Independence, depending upon which side you are on. Now, the comparison of India and Europe is interesting that they both had invasion of different tribes over the millennia from the plains of Central Asia, primarily Scythians, Huns, Mongols, and the religions include Christianity for Europe, Hinduism for India. Again, then the cultural spread of Europe is all over the world. Indian cultural spread was over Southeast Asia. And again, we mentioned about Islam. There was Europeans indulged in slavery on a rather big way. And while even in India, there was slavery primarily by Arab traders from the African coast, and they sold slaves to Indian princes. And again, some of them were gainfully employed in the military, and a small number of African tribes are still settled in primarily in the wooded forest of India. And the ancestry is very apparent just from simple physical appearances. And again, the Europe had a far earlier start in Enlightenment, Industrial Revolution, while India was lagging behind in spite of being under British rule, or perhaps because of being under British rule. And they finally, after 1990, the sleeping Indian giant has woken up and has adopted a capitalistic system, while earlier, after independence, it was slowed down by socialistic goals. Again, some of the neighborhoods of Europe and India are worth comparison, that both have Muslim neighbors, for Turkey, for Europe, while Pakistan for India. And again, the comparison is interesting in terms of various stereotype for ethnicity of the Germans versus South Indians, and the mercenary Swiss and Hessians versus Gurkhas and Sikh, who were labeled as martial race by the British. Again, so that's just an interesting diversion for comparison. Now, again, as I mentioned earlier, most of the entry to the Indian subcontinent took place via the northern route, or the northwest frontier, as it was called, and which is bordering present-day Afghanistan in the north, and Iran in directly in the west. Okay, and at that time there was no Pakistan, and after the division in 47, as you can see from this picture, that the open border makes a rather popular show and entertainment for soldiers trying to outmarch each other in a show of nationalistic pride. And so these are some of the geographical features of India, as we talked about, and it extends from about 24 degrees north and 79 degrees on the latitude. Now, the Indian history can be divided into three main regions. The British historians elected to divide history into Hindu, Muslim, and British era in neat, clear-cut divisions, but the history is more mixed than we would like to think. And the Indian historians rightly divide it into ancient, medieval, and modern history phases. And we'll go by that systematically, starting with the ancient era. Now, again, the human migration history is far longer than either Europe or Indian subcontinent. The original migration out of Africa took place about 60 to 70,000 years ago, and the people across the Arabian Peninsula first inhabited Indian subcontinent, and then across the land bridge from what is Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, ended up as far down south as Australia. Okay, and this has been well proven with genetic studies, and the subsequent migration was by Iranian farmers from the Middle East and Mesopotamia area. The third big migration that took place was so-called Aryan invasion, or a migration of the pastoral people from the Asian plains, Asian mountain region. The two clades migrated, one towards Europe and another towards Indo-Iranian branches. And this has been well established with genetic studies by a very competent team of geneticists named David Reich out of Harvard. And this was a slide taken from his book about the peopling. And then the Indian population, he divided, instead of using labels such as Aryans and the older label called Dravidians, and to avoid political controversy, he divided into North Indian and South Indian ancestral origin, and now and a small mixture in the central India of Indian hunter-gatherers. Okay, now so these are the main routes of migrations that took place, as we talked about earlier. Now, the Indian peninsula has been inhabited by people as far back as 30,000 years ago, or perhaps even longer. This is well evidenced by the rock carvings that have been discovered in various caves in a place which is named as Bhimbetka cave in the central India. And these paintings have been dated to be as far back as 30 plus thousand years old. And one popular rock is referred to as Zoo rock, which depicts elephants, local deer, and peacock and snake. So it clearly shows that the area subcontinent has been continuously habited by humanity. And these are not as famous as the caves in the south of France, but again, it shows that people made to both areas quite a long time ago. Now, this may come as a surprise to you that there are tribal people in the subcontinent as well. And, uh, and these live in isolated areas. They avoid contact with the so-called more modern civilization. And genetically, they clearly have an Australo-Asian link. And the powers to be have tried to maintain contacts with them with little success from time to time. And again, so they've been left to their own devices, and they primarily do some agriculture, but are mostly hunter-gatherers tribe. And some of the earliest ones are in the middle of Bay of Bengal in an area called Andaman Island. And as recently as 2018, a rather over-enthusiastic American missionary tried to venture, in spite of the advice from the authorities not to travel, and to convert these people to Christianity, and sadly lost his life. And so these people are relatively small in number, and there is very little contact per se with the Indian government. Now, again, as we talked about, the major civilization that was discovered accidentally when the British Empire was trying to establish uh, railway lines to the border of what is presently Afghanistan, and the locals discovered a mount which was a good source for bricks. And doing further excavation that led to the findings of so-called new old Indus Valley civilization, based on archaeological find that has been dated to be as a Bronze Age civilization, based on the pottery and the works and the works that have been discovered. Now, and this further, the civilization was rather advanced, as it's seen in the well-defined architecture of the area. And this video explains
the ancient
it rather
city
nicely.
of Mohenjo-Daro is one of the first urban centers in human history. Nestled in southern Pakistan's Indus River Valley, Mohenjo-Daro is the largest and best preserved city of the Indus civilization, the earliest known civilization of the Indian subcontinent. Mohenjo-Daro was built around 2500 BC, about the same time the Great Pyramids were being built in Egypt, and it spanned a surface area of nearly 500 acres, an incredible size for a city of this time period. Because of Mohenjo-Daro's grand scale, archaeologists believe it may have served as a seat of power for the Indus civilization. The city was divided into two districts, the Citadel and the Lower Town. The Citadel is home to the city's exceptional monuments, including the Great Bath, a 900 square foot tank fed from the Indus River. Mohenjo-Daro also had a sophisticated water system. Houses had baths and toilets, and the town featured both an elaborate sewage system and fresh water in 700 wells throughout the city. The Roman baths, some of history's most famous waterway systems, weren't constructed until many hundreds of years after Mohenjo-Daro's Great Bath. Mohenjo-Daro has no places of worship or governance, such as palaces, royal tombs, or temples. This may indicate that the society was not built around state interests like the Egyptian and Mesopotamian societies of the time. Rather, the class structure of Mohenjo-Daro may have been relatively equal. The city's second district, the Lower Town, may demonstrate the society's egalitarian structure. The Lower Town, with its intricate water system, was home to between 20,000 to 40,000 people. Unlike many urban areas of its time, it was laid out in a grid system similar to modern-day city blocks. After approximately 600 years, the city collapsed. No one is quite sure why, but the cause could potentially have been a change within the culture, or in the path of the river. Without its crucial source of water, the city's residents may have moved away, leaving Mohenjo-Daro nearly abandoned. In 1911, nearly 4,000 years after the city fell into ruin, archaeologists paid their first visit. The ensuing decades of excavations have unearthed countless clues that tell the tale of Mohenjo-Daro, but it still holds secrets for us to discover.
And as here we can see some of the sculpture, bronzes sculpture that were excavated, the classical poster of a sculpture of a dancing girl. As you can see that she has a time for decorations and a rather elaborate hairstyle and is clearly enjoying herself. And the statue is about 4.5 inches tall and a very natural position. It's a well-preserved cultural artifact of Indus Valley civilization. And these were discovered by British archaeologist named Ernest Mackay in 1926. And it's held in the National Museum of New Delhi. The other side represents rather an older individual, a shaman or a priest, and again wearing decorative clothing and hairstyle. And we saw some of these pictures earlier about the communal bath, which was rather large and again was well elaborate structures with well laid out staircases, tanks, and they had plenty of water supply as we saw in the video earlier. And again, some of the artifacts and the toys were discovered. And obviously, we do not see any chariots. So this was precedes the arrival of the chariot riding pastoral people from the Central Plains. And various copper and bronze implements have been discovered. Again, the end of civilization, as we saw in the video, was becomes rather an enigma, and it may have more to do with climate change rather than actual warfare, simply because no skeletons have been found. And again, there was evidence of trading with Mesopotamian culture. And various, now the biggest difficulty with the Indus Valley civilization has been that nobody has been able to decipher the script. There has not been any discovery of so-called Rosetta Stone for the Indus Valley. The main peopling of India, or which is signified by the rise of Hindu culture, dates back to the arrival of Aryans, or the people who rode chariots and were successfully able to tame horses and migrated through from the Central Plains. And the origin of Aryans was in the Indian classical epics, Mahabharata and Ramayana, and the Vedas. It was mentioned the word Aryan, but nobody was quite sure about the actual date of arrival. Now, some of the similarities with the European clan was established by a rather intrepid investigator who was appointed a Supreme Court judge in present-day Calcutta, working for the East India Company in 1790. And he was a philologist and a scholar and a polymath, to put it mildly. And he discovered the linguistic link between Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin, and thus establishing that the migrating people had common origin. Again, it was very not sure exactly where they came from. Now, after translating some of the languages in which there was mention of Greek satraps, and at that time they were able to establish the same literature from the Greeks, and primarily histories of Herodotus, and some of the names that were rather mispronounced or misspelled. But he was able to link two and two together with the arrival of Alexander the Great. And depending upon some of the mountain carvings that were seen in the Gangetic Plains, he was able to put a more firm date, somewhere around 1500 before current era. And so the rise of Vedic civilization, we can safely say that occurred probably around 1500 before current era. And it gradually evolved And the primary language of that time was Sanskrit, which evolved into modern Indian languages. Again, that the culture was primarily pastoral. And this may come as a surprise or shock to you that the swastika and the well known Om, which is well known to the yogic practitioners, have a long history dating back to the Vedic era and the Aryan civilization. And the Indians, Vedic gods, it was polytheist religion, but primarily they had rather advanced philosophy, as mentioned in the Vedas and Upanishads. And again, with the three forms, the creator, the destroyer, and the preserver, were the three concepts. And some of the philosophies of Vedas and Upanishads, it's rather complex and actually questions the existence of God, as we'll talk about a little later. The primary religion earlier were rather simplistic and included worship of fire, earth, and the natural forces. And over the hundreds of years, it became more established with primarily ritualistic and with various hymns which were passed on orally from generation to generation and by the priestly caste. And again, there are various similarities to the Greek culture of the various gods, and the trident is well mentioned in both cultures. So you can see that all the peoples had a similar uh, belief systems. And some of the similarities can be seen even in the biblical origin. There are all the major civilization of the world have mention of the floods, and whether it is Babylonian or Egyptian or Indian or Chinese. And that is, shouldn't come as a surprise to you. And again, this is some of the deep thought philosophy from the Rig Veda that questions the existence of or non-existence of God as to who really can tell. Even he himself perhaps doesn't know. And that is a rather deep philosophical thinking about questioning as to how, as perhaps humans, we made gods in our own images. And we mentioned as to how the early Vedic period gradually transitioned into the later area where the kings and the powerful men established various kingdoms, in primarily in the northern fertile Gangetic plains, and the economy changed from pastoral to agrarian, and from various class-based society, the gradual formation of caste system, which became more rigid, and again, the sacrificial, ritualistic religion took place over hundreds of years. And the two classic Indian epics, which are similar to, or even much larger than the Iliad and Odyssey, and they are called Mahabharata and Ramayana. Mahabharata comprises of as many as 24,000 verses. And believe it or not, that those were originally transmitted oral tradition, and the first paper script appears several hundred years later. And these are the classical tales of the good versus evil uh, battles which took place between the northern kings and the southern kings, and that is well depicted. And similarly, and in another epic called Ramayana, where the fight of the good and evil are depicted. And again, there are a lot of morality stories that are there, and these are well known to every Indian child, irrespective of religion growing up. And these were quite popular, even rebroadcast on television channel back in the early 80s, and gathered some of the largest audiences, and were again replayed during the lockdown. And so these become part of the cultural fabric of the Indian civilization. And the so-called Indians do not have an established religion text like the Bible or the Quran, but the sacred Gita is part of the sermon of of Mahabharata, during which Lord Krishna gives a sermon to the warrior Arjuna that his duty is to fight and do his duty, irrespective of the of concerns about outcome. So that is the foundation of the philosophy of karma and the various yogic tradition which date back to Mahabharata again. several thousand years old. And again, the much well-known and caste system took place and from the Vedic civilization, the Brahmins, the priests and teachers being at the on the top, the warriors, some to follow, and the traders and artisans, and the last but not the least, the Sudras or the untouchable, which has been the so-called not quite the slavery status of India, but the untouchability was the biggest stain on the Indian Vedic civilization, and Mahatma Gandhi did a lot to eliminate that in the system. And it has been outlawed in the Indian constitution, but it still persists to uh, some extent, especially in the villages, and raises its ugly head from time to time. And again, so we can see here we have nicely depicted the caste system. And again, that may have something to do with not only the occupation, but the phenotypic appearance that some of the people who may have migrated to the south and they were considered dasas or darker skinned people. And they made up of the Shudra, the laboring caste. And again, we talked about the untouchability problems, and that may have to be associated with the gravedigger work or the so-called impure work, and might have some basis in the health, uh, preserving health of the community as to avoiding infections. That's the way pork is avoided in the Middle Eastern civilization. And but again, it has become well entrenched, and it's been hard to eliminate, although the government and the people are uh, making some serious attempts by reserving scheduled caste and tribe seats, and again becoming a bone of contention with the upper classes in the recent past. And these are some of the depiction of the various kingdoms that were established primarily in the foothills of Himalayas and in the fertile plains. And there's several words which were incorporated in Sanskrit, which is called the Mahajana, which is the great foothold tribe. And there were several oligarchic republics were established in ancient India, which it arose around 6th century before current era to 4th century current era. And these were so-called republic, like not unlike the Greek or the Roman states, city-states, with a surrounding area, and the control of the area extended back and forth. And as you can see, some of these kingdoms extended as far back as the northwest territory in what is Gandhara, which is present-day Afghanistan, from which the name Kandahar arose, and which is well known during the East and Afghan wars. Again, the 6th century, again, this was the main turning point of the Indian history, and from Bronze Age civilization, the northern black polished ware became available. And by this time, iron was mined and the weaponry became more sophisticated, again, leading to more infighting. And again, as we mentioned earlier, the main contact with the Western civilization was when Alexander the Great, during his world conquest, attempts reached all the way to the northwest border of India and fought with a local prince called King Porus or Paurava. And again, and he managed to win, but at that time his soldiers had enough and decided to turn back. And he died somewhere during the sea route in the Middle East. And the cultural influence of Greece was left because he appointed several deputies called satrapas, and there's been a substantial cultural mix that took place in primarily the northwest region. And at that time, it was called Gandhara or Bactria region, and extending into the northern Asia, and it's and what is present day Tashkent and the Pamir Mountains. And there was a cultural exchange along the Silk Route that took place between the Chinese, the Central Asian, the Persian, and the Indian cultures that took place. And and there is a small tribe in what is present day Pakistan called Kalash, and who were thought to be descendants of the Greeks because of their appearance and skin tones. But some of the recent genetic evidence has disproved that that does not appear to be the case. But they have their separate culture, although uh, in recent past, quite a few of them have converted to Islam, but they had their own identity for thousands of years. And now, in 6th century BC, before current era, was the big so-called axial age. The word was defined by a German archaeologist, and at that time, the major religions rose in primarily in India, in as a reform movement in Hinduism, and that was the advent of Buddhism. And the another religion that arose at that time was called Jainism, which is even older than Buddhism. But unlike Buddhism, Jainism never traveled outside the subcontinent and it still maintains a rather small but a very powerful influence in the Indian commercial communities as well as the Indian culture. And Buddhism spread is well known, what traveled from India to Southeast Asia, China, Japan, and and is still actively practiced. And some of the records of that part are maintained by the Chinese travelers who traveled along the Silk Route and also along the Sea Route and have maintained meticulous records of the Indian culture at that time. And so we have some corroborative evidence first from the Greek historians and travelers, at the same time the Chinese travelers of the Indian uh, kingdoms, which were in the primarily in the northern region, and their sculpture, their people, their lifestyle, and their success stories have been well documented by these travelers. Now, again, by that time, the Persian Empire had a huge influence on the West Coast. But again, the Persians never managed to conquer India until they collapsed under the rise of Islam. And that's another story. The Jainism, again, is a pioneer of nonviolence and what is known as ahimsa, and believes in many-sided reality and a non-attachment philosophy. So that philosophy is rather complex. And again, and swastika and ahimsa are the big uh, cornerstones of Jain therapy, Jain religion. And again, some of the classical texts that have been maintained in Jainism includes 5 vows that have taken place, which include ahimsa, truth, celibacy, non-possessiveness, and believing in eternal universe. And there are some of the Jain monks live a very ascetic lifestyle and live on very hard lifestyle and with prayers and preaching throughout their life. And some of the Jain sculptures and architecture that is spread primarily on the west coast of India and in southern India include some of the statues, which are magnificent. And as we'll see in some of the next slides, here is an example of it in a statue called Gomateshwara, and that is as large as 57 feet monolith carved from a single piece of rock on hillside in what is Karnataka, which is the technological hub of India. And these are some of the Jain temples which were built. So a little later, around 11th and 13th century current era, and these are made of intricate marble carvings. And these are the 5 large temples that you can see here. And some of the most beautiful pilgrimage sites in the world are still well preserved, and some of them were damaged by the Islamic invasion, but quite a few of them are still well preserved and are sight worth seeing. And here is an inside view of the carvings of one of the temples in North Gujarat, which is on the west coast of India. Now, at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, the cultural exchange took place in the northwest corner uh, dating as far back as 400 before current era. And this was probably one of some of the earliest established universities in a place called Takshashila. And that was a crossroad of Persia, India, and the Silk Road. And the people came to learn Buddhist civilization, Sanskrit, and uh, mathematics, and sciences, astrology, and astronomy, and the languages, of course. So there was a huge cultural admixture that takes place, and this was later on destroyed by the White Huns invasion, and also by Ghazni, which was the rise of the Islamic Empire in present-day Afghanistan. So this was one of the big centers of learning in the Indus Valley. Now, one of the biggest empire that was around the time of trip by Alexander was called Maurya Empire, which you can see this was the first time an Indian king managed to control Indian subcontinent from Afghanistan and north into northwest to all the way near the tip of South India and extending almost to the present day Burma. So this was one of the first times that almost all of India was under one rule. And this was called the rise of the Mauryan Empire. And along with the rise of the various major religions, as we discussed earlier, Jainism, and some of the records of that time are very impressive. That at that time they had a strong economic policy, and including writings on the art of governing, including spies and how the king should behave, and this has been well documented, and almost and his grandson was even outdid the founder of the empire, Chandragupta, and who we'll talk about in a few seconds. And again, this was mentioned in the Greek literature as the name was mispronounced as Sandrakotas, but it was proven with translation from the English was that happens to be Chandragupta. And this was well documented by Megasthenes in his Indica, the great records of the Alexander era. And he also writes about visiting Sandrakota's empire, the king of Indians, and he very well describes the fertile economy, the presence of elephants, various philosophers, farmers, herders, artisans, and it shows that it was a very successful empire, the contemporary of Alexander's visit to the northern coast. And we mentioned about Taxila, and this was the rise of the Indian medicine, the father of the Indian medicine called Charaka, who did surgeries for cataract as well as for kidney stones. And the rise of the former grammar, Panini grammar, was around the same time. And Chanakya was the military and the political strategist. So this was a well-run empire which lasted for several hundred years. Now, as I mentioned, his grandson was named Ashoka, who ruled around 260 before current era. And turns out that he managed to fought a battle with one of the southern kings on the epic battle, which turned him into a pacifist. He saw that even though he managed to win, he saw how much carnage that had taken place, and that is the time when he turned to the Buddhist faith and decided they adopted ahimsa as philosophy and managed to spread the word of nonviolence and to not just in all over India, but also to Southeast Asia. He sent his own children as emissaries to various kingdoms in Southeast Asia. And the discovery of Ashoka was rather interesting, that he was lost to the Indian history primarily due to the fact that some of the carvings were in different language and were on the side of the mountain, and the mountains were covered by jungles, and Surprisingly, during the British era, some of the archaeological uh, finds were established by various intrepid investigator, primarily named James Prinsep, and the various cave carvings were discovered in Sri Lanka, on the west coast of India, and in the Himalayan plains. And based on that, they were able to prove that the name Ashoka was lost to the history, and that they were able to put all the three things together. And there's a very nice written book called The Search for the Lost Emperor by a popular English historian named Charles Allen, which makes a good reading. And we talked about the spread of Buddhism, which took several hundred years, but starting from uh, 500 before current era to 600, this uh, Buddhism spread along the northern as well as southern route from the Indian subcontinent, along the Silk Road and via sea to Sumatra, Java, Indonesia, and to Sri Lanka, of course. And the two Buddhism divide into two main sects, Mahayana and Hinayana. And this was introduced by various merchants along the trade routes to Thailand and parts of Indonesia. And the Indian philosophy has become interesting as to and can be classified into various uh, people, the pre-Aryans, the Indo-Aryans, the Greek, the Scythians, the Huns, the Turks. All of them have gradually traveled to India and have mixed very nicely over the number of years. And so genetically, as well as culturally and linguistically, there has been a huge admixture that has taken place in the Indian subcontinent. Okay, so I think we'll stop here and continue the next time.